Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Dean Spade. Dean is a writer, professor, and activist who has been part of struggles against policing, prison, immigration enforcement, and poverty for the last 2 decades. In 2002, he founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit collective that provides free legal help to low-income people and people of color who are trans, intersex, and/or gender nonconforming, and works to build trans resistance rooted in racial and economic justice. He is the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. Today we talk about his forthcoming book with the working title, It's Not You, It's Everybody, a book for people trying to live with meaning and connected to others in this challenging world. We dive into ideas about activism, self-help, and self-care, exploring different ways to help ourselves and others, which are in alignment with radical queer feminist, anti-capitalist values. Find Dean and his work at deanspade.net. Hi, Dean. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Dean, you are an author and an activist and a lawyer, and I thought we would start out by having you share with us a story about how you first got interested in practicing law.
I think that the way that I came to that path is, a little bit random, like many people's life stories. But I was in an activist world in New York City in the mid-1990s, where I was doing activism with other queers, including like elder queers, people older than me. I was in my early 20s who had been active in ACT UP and were part of bigger coalitions against the things Rudy Giuliani was doing to New York City, like things that are very queer specific, like crackdowns on queer spaces, queer bars and clubs and parks where queer people gathered and stuff, but also like a general kind of anti-poor, anti-sex work, anti-taxi driver, like racist kind of pro-police governance that was Giuliani's style to drastically change New York City. And I was part of all of that work. And as part of that, I could really see the ways that law and law enforcement were harming people I cared about. So I think I had some idea that something about going to law school would give me tools that would in some way help. And I can't say that was like incredibly, incredibly well thought out. Now I have more complicated feelings about the limited roles of lawyers actually in some of those, in some social movement contexts, but that was the path that I went down, and really made me want to be a poverty lawyer and have my legal work be centered on people facing police violence, people on welfare, people in foster care, those kinds of settings.
Mm-hmm. And the main way that you relate to law now is through teaching, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm part of a lot of activist work that's related to legal systems. So most of my work is about trying to end prisons and policing and immigration enforcement. And so there's a lot of relationships to law in that. And I do less practicing law and more directly supporting people in prison or doing work in community groups that are trying to stop prisons and jails from being built or expanded, or trying to get things shut down that are different kinds of prisons and jails and the immigration system or the criminal system. But I also, like, my paid gig is that I teach law at a law school. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what made you decide to start teaching?
Basically, I was working at the organization I founded, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a poverty law organization based in New York City that provides free legal help to trans and gender nonconforming people who are low income or people of color. And our belief in that organization was, like, we have this assessment that a lot of poverty law organizations and a lot of nonprofits in general are like run by their founders forever. And we were operating as a collective and really trying to decenter the leadership of any one person, especially any one white person. And for me, I wanted to cycle off the staff. So stay in the collective, but not be on the staff, so that we could work against that founder's dynamic. Because even if you operate as a collective, there can still be those power dynamics happening. And so I needed some kind of other job. And I ended up first in a law teaching fellowship. It was just like another way to have a place to work. And it's a great job because you have a lot of control over your own time and you're basically getting paid to read, write, and think about ideas. And there's a lot of space for your activism. And so one thing led to another, and I kept being able to stay in that role. So I've just continued teaching since that was 2007 or something.
Mm-hmm. I was just curious to know if part of your drive to teach was as a way to bring some of the ideas that you believe in to lawyers who may not normally get that education without someone with that perspective teaching them.
I do love sharing ideas in a classroom. Like, I just personally thoroughly enjoy that and find it fun. I think my assessment after having been teaching in law schools in various ways for 15 years or so, actually, because I started doing it while I was still working at SRLP, I would adjunct teach classes. I think a lot of people, by the time they've gotten to law school, are pretty bought into a pretty narrow idea of what lawyers can do. And law school is a very intense socialization practice that often limits people's frameworks for imagining what they can do in the world in ways that are a little bit heartbreaking, I think, and can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction. So I guess I don't overestimate how much I can radicalize people who are in law school, but I definitely think that like introducing people who are in law school and maybe want to be poverty lawyers to like the critiques of the nonprofit system, to the idea of prison abolition, to questions about the limits of law reform and the problematic ways that lawyers behave in movements, like all of that I think is useful. And I definitely have students who've taken those ideas and had them really influence their careers. And also, I think I don't ever overestimate my level of influence in the context of law schools.
Mm-hmm. I guess I was just thinking about people I know who teach in psychology programs as a way to bring new ideas to students who may not have thought about them in a way before. But I also realized that the psychology of a student who is seeking law degree is probably different than the psychology of a student who is seeking education in psychology.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it's similar in that in any professional program, we can be trying to intervene on the like inevitably like racist and hierarchical norms of that profession. And on the other hand, people who go to law school to some degree are more risk averse, believe in being inside systems, maybe seeking status and power, like have some of those qualities that might make them less open to transformative ideas. Although I also see, even in the last like 4 years, the kinds of political conditions we're living in, and I do see more students hungry for a new way of thinking about their experience and the harms that legal systems cause, and less defensive of legal systems. And there's also people who are more defensive right now, so it's a mixed bag. But yeah, I do think the profile of people who go, although to some degree, I'm sure that there's also people who are motivated by wanting to be in positions of authority who go into school to be a therapist. I could see that possibly as well.
That's all possibly true. Yes. So what I also want to talk about is your book that you're currently working on, which is the main thing that we wanted to talk about today. And it's called, or it's the current title is It's Not You, It's Everybody. So can you share a little bit about what this book is before we dive into the deeper aspects of it?
Yeah, I have not talked a ton about this book publicly. I've been working on it for 5 or 6 years, but have felt somewhat shy about it because it's essentially a self-help book for people who, want to change the world. And if that's a departure from what my prior writing has mostly been about. But I have been, while being in activist worlds and trying to be part of change for the last 2 decades, I've also the entire time been on my own healing journey and been like very much trying to figure out how to shift a lot of things in myself and look at my reactions to things and change, recover from trauma and find ways of being that feel like connected and alive with myself and others. And I've spent a lot of that time diving into many self-help worlds, and most of it is pretty rough for radicals. It's like a lot of really heterosexist, racist, colonial stuff that you find in that genre very intensely. And so it's been this process of sometimes learning a great deal from things, but also being like, I can't really, in good conscience, share this with anybody or ask anyone else to read this because there's all this horrible stuff in here too. So part of me wanted to do a little bit of like bridge work, like help some of the things that I found useful in those realms and things that I've learned, put them in context, because it's like, you read about something like the ways we all treat each other terribly or feel terrible inside romance or inside our workplaces. You read about those things in the self-help genre, and it's all about like what's wrong with the individual and what you can work on. And it totally forgets that like, oh, hetero-patriarchy is shaping that. Capitalism is shaping that. Right. And so I wanted to be able to talk about some of those tools, but in the context that I think those of us who are awake to the conditions we're living in and concerned about them, understand them in. And also I'm in all these movements where we actually are like wrecking ourselves and each other in how we do our dating and how we do our collaborating and work and how we do our numbing. And so I see a desire and I feel a desire for those conversations, but I think a lot of limits to traditional self-help genres. And actually lately I've been seeing more people writing stuff like what I'm working on. Like I'm seeing more books and materials coming out that I think speak to, are putting these questions about healing and about how we relate into a politicized context, which I'm really excited about.
Mm-hmm. Now, I just have to admit, when I hear you say the term self-help, there's this part of me that kind of goes, it's not a cringe. It's just kind of like, I don't know what it is, but there's something about that term that feels so dated. It almost sounds a little 80s to me. But I also totally understand what it is. But for people out there who may have a certain idea about what quote unquote self-help is, what would you say to them about that and about this book being labeled as that?
I mean, yes, that term makes me cringe like a million jillion times, which is why I haven't told anyone about the project for years I'm working it. And I think the reason I'm just trying to like be frank about that, but almost sounds like a joke to me, is for the same reasons. I feel, that genre is like, you'll get skinny and married in 30 days if you do everything in our book. Like this is the opposite of what I believe healing is or what I believe transformation is for us interpersonally or for our society. It's not fast. It's not about meeting societal norms. But that is what the self-help genre, a lot of it feels like and looks like. And I think what I'm really trying to work on instead is, which we could call, I think the reason I say it's self-help is because it is, I don't want to like hide the fact that it is part of that conversation, but what would that conversation look like if we were actually trying to have it with an awareness of the fact that our internal experiences of ourselves are so deeply shaped by capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism and hetero-patriarchy and ableism. And if we actually were able to not say those things are out there and we need to like, knock them down and take them down and have a new society without facing the fact that we're not ready to live in that society yet because we're still recreating, these relationships all the time interpersonally, right? We still act, we still social climb inside how we think about our activist group or our dating. We still dispose of each other in the exact way that we've been trained to in a society that's the most imprisoning that's ever existed in the history of the world. Like this stuff is inside and outside of us. And if we want to heal it, the work is on both levels. And so I think that's what I'm trying to be part of the conversation about with this book. But I think if I were like to have to put it in a bookstore on a shelf, somebody might end up putting it in the self-help section. They also might put it in the gender studies section, or they might put it in like, I don't know. Yeah,
I think we just need to retitle and rebrand that genre. I don't know what that will be, but we'll leave that up to someone else for now.
I think the kinds of terms people are using in our communities now are terms like healing justice, community care. I think there are other terms emerging that are trying to get at the desire to not have it be an individualized framework about our wellness.
So can you share with us of the ideas that you bring into the book about the ways that people can start to change that internal relationship with their self in order to have a better relationship with the outside world?
Yeah. The book has a lot of stuff in it. So, there's like a whole section on romance and dating, and there's a big section on like work and collaboration and conflict and collaborate in our collaborations and our groups and stuff that happens to us in groups. And there's a lot of stuff about technology and call out culture. And there's a lot of different pieces. But I think one thread I'll pick up that I think is throughout is this question about learning to notice our autopilot behaviors or automatic behaviors. Like, I'll just speak for myself. Like when I'm in a group, because I have like a deep wound about like self-worthiness and whether or not I'm like okay and deserve to exist, I'm like, I've got to do stuff to show them that I'm worth being here. So I like overcommit and overdo. And then I also do that in my personal life. I'll be like just doing. So for me, like just even learning to notice an autopilot move like that. Or another example in my life is that I'm an overconnector. Like because of some, this old, childhood stuff about self-worth, I might be like, I have too much tendency to try to like, just like overextend myself. I'm like, Nick, we just met. Do you want me to pick you up from the airport? And I'm overextended and I'm going to every event and wanting everyone to feel seen and heard by me. Like that is can be wonderful. It can be a support to my life. It can be, I'm not a very isolated person. There's a lot of great things about it. And then there's also like some real ways in which it's gotten in the way of what I want and who I want to be. And so I think like one theme in the book is looking at our automatic or autopilot behaviors. It's noticing what we're practicing over and over again that's not really serving us. And then there's a lot of different approaches in the book to how we might become more aware of those and be willing to or interested in like what are other options, or how could I have 5% less overextension, or what would I do at the next party that would be different if I wasn't in my overextension mode, or what would I do at the next meeting if I said I'm going to wait 10 seconds before volunteering for a task to see if anyone else volunteers for it first, and I'm going to look at what's on my plate right now before I go into this meeting, decide I'm not taking on any tasks that involve writing more than 2 pages, or whatever makes sense for me. So there's a lot of, that's like a theme. It's a theme around how people relate to their drugs and alcohol, how people relate to the internet, how people relate to dating and flirting and sex. Like all of these things are areas where we have autopilot behaviors that often stem from a wound or an old story. And we can try to shift and learn about that old story and wound, but also there's like a tension to the practices that emerge from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, also part of what I'm hearing is what I know of to be as really important for people who are highly active activists, which is the idea of making sure that you're taking care of yourself. And I know that in some circles, this idea of self-care gets a bad rap or criticized, which I think is actually helpful. And I actually want to read a quote that you have in your book and then talk about it a little bit more. So you quoted, "Caring for ourselves doesn't mean pacifying ourselves. We should be suspicious of any understanding of self-care that identifies well-being with placidity or asks us to perform health for others." So I wonder if you can say more about your ideas about what new ideas or radical ideas of self-care can look like for people.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say, like, I think there is such an important debate going on, right? Because on the one hand, we live in a capitalist society that has like this really intense thing where like you're only worth something based on how much you can work and make profit for others, unless you're just like super rich and then nobody cares about what you do, because that's where you just get to just automatically be the best. But for most people, there's this pressure to produce and to work. And so you have to take care of yourself well enough to get back to work is kind of the rationale, which is the opposite of like a healing framework. And we also live in a context where there's a lot of reasons people are like really not taking care of ourselves, right? We're like told to be incredibly distracted by a million other things that are, and not know how we feel and not know if we're hungry or if we are in an uncomfortable relationship, or if, you know, we're just supposed to be numb to a lot of harm that we do to others. We're supposed to be numb to a lot of harm that's done to us. There's a lot of ways in which it's very hard to learn to take care of ourselves. And at the same time, we're going through a period where self-care is kind of being marketed, and most of it is about different things we can consume. So there's a lot of like take care of yourself, you know, and then buy these expensive beauty regimes, or a lot of it is to take care of yourself by escaping, right? Like by checking out, numbing. So those are like intense, concerning questions that we can have for ourselves. Like, how can we take seriously the fact that there's so much to learn about caring for ourselves and each other, and also get away from the kind of individualist, consumerist approach to care that is the one that will be sold to us, where, you know, and that, the way that can look interpersonally is like, I'm doing self-care, but I'm like disappearing on all my friends and all of my obligations, and actually just like going in on a bender and being wasted and being like, I just take care of myself. You know, there's lots of ways we can use those rationales inside ourselves to justify behavior that might actually be caring for ourselves or others. So there's a lot of complexity in this. And I think holding that complexity is really vital, and learning what our like automatic tendencies are. Like, oh, do I avoid taking care of myself and put everyone else first? Or do I like to check out and then I call it self-care because I want to rationalize it? Or, you know, what would care look like? I think there's some questions we can ask ourselves. Like, I actually learned some of this from the generative somatics framework, this idea of asking if an activity is actually building my resilience or not. Do I feel more open and connected and alive after it, or do I feel more numb? So for me personally, if I watch TV, I feel more numb afterwards. I don't feel more open and connected and alive. But if I walk outside, I personally do feel more open and connected and alive afterwards. So, you know, people vary, but even just being able to learn, which is really hard, slowly, like, whoa, what are the impacts of some of the things I do on me? Like, I think a lot of us don't ask. We're not like, oh, how did that feel, you know, playing that game on my phone? Or how do I feel after I talk to that person? Or there's a lot of just moving on and being numb, So I think those are some of the questions that I would invite. And then also like, what are the ways that I can care for myself that I can really think about in the context of like the planet I live on? Like, we live in a society, built on imperialism and colonialism. And so the story in the US, the ultimate story of self-care is like, leave the United States and go to a beachy place in a foreign country where you're a tourist. I mean, it's like horrible for the environment, it's horrible for the people who live there. It's part of an entire, history of imperial warfare that made that all possible. So can I critique like the self-care narratives I've been handed about what feels good and feels relaxing and be like, are there ways for me to feel good and feel relaxed and connected and recover from hard things that are happening, or have space to digest my experiences that are also aligned with my values and beliefs about what might make us all more well or help us all survive. And so I think those questions are really on the surface. I think especially as so many of us are confronting climate change in a really serious way and looking at how many of our behaviors impact everyone. So I think there's a lot in the self-care debates that's really rich and useful. And I think I just also want to center like the most interesting learnings for me in the self-care debates have been from people in the disability justice framework, who have helped me think carefully about the ways that ideas about healthiness and healthy behavior and healthy relationships and healthy reactions, all of that can be very ableist, can really be about like a single idea of a healthy body or mind. And so how can we have a more robust and complex idea of what like wellness or healing is, while keeping in mind that danger of ableist norms? And then also, how can we pay attention? I think especially because justice activists ask us to look at how we're all in economies of care together. It's not about like an individual takes care of themselves. There's kind of this idea that we're all kind of be like separate capitalist consumers, instead of the reality that, of course, care is labor that we're all constantly doing for one another. And a lot of that care labor is hidden, and people need different kinds of care labor in their lives, depending on what their lives are like. And so just kind of moving towards like a feminist and disability justice framework around care that gets us out of just thinking about like, I'm going to go get a massage, or I'm going to like just this kind of individual set of choices. And instead like, wow, so I'm in like a whole household, and I'm also in like a food system in my town, and I'm also and globally, and I'm also in, who am I giving emotional care to, and who am I receiving it from, and call me an emergency, and who can I call, and who am I visiting when they're sick, and who's visiting me, and all, like really having just kind of wondering how can we live ethically and with deep awareness inside the inequalities that exist in care systems right now, and how can I be well through also being being of service also in a variety of care relationships with people who may be differently positioned than me and need different things than me. Yeah, instead of this kind of like individualist, like, get what you can and personal responsibility and all these kind of conservative ideas that I think are actually underlying a lot of the like self-care being sold as like, neoliberal, you're required to manage yourself and you should do that by having the right vacation and also spending money in the right places.
Wow, you just gave me a lot to think about, and I had a lot of different thoughts as you were speaking. But one of the things that really stood out to me that you mentioned a couple times was, do I feel connected after I do this particular activity that might be considered self-care? And one of the things that I also read that you wrote was that sometimes self-care doesn't look relaxing per se, and it's not, I think in itself, part of this this idea of quote unquote self-care and self-help have the word self in it. And so there's this idea of it being solo or doing it just for yourself, as opposed to being connected might mean being connected and doing something for someone else. Getting outside of yourself in order to help other people can sometimes help you feel really connected or really rejuvenated by volunteering, at a soup kitchen. Or I just saw an article the other day about a large group of, I think they were scuba divers in Florida, who went and cleaned garbage off the ocean floor. And I can imagine for those people, that is something that is getting them in their body. They're getting exercise, but they're also doing something for the planet, and they're doing it in community. And so there's ways that all of those different levels are being touched. And even though they may have felt physically exhausted by the end, they really got connected with themselves and with community and with the earth. And then I also really liked how you wrote about that sometimes self-help can look like getting angry and screaming or going out and marching. And even though that might feel challenging on one level, it can feel like someone is actually doing something instead of feeling depressed when they're home alone and angry at the world or angry at themselves and feeling like they're taking some kind of action, and then can feel rejuvenated or like they've had some kind of cathartic release at the end of it. So I really appreciate, all these ways that you're starting to bring up these topics of what quote unquote self-help can look like.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been reading like the mainstream literature about happiness, which is interesting. And it, really shows that like people think that consumer goods will make them happy, and they don't. And that what makes people happy is connection and having relationships and having someone to confide in. And I've also been reading the mainstream literature on loneliness and how people are more lonely than we've ever been in the United States. And also that like unhappiness and loneliness like correlate to how much advertising you see and how, because it's like it makes you feel bad about yourself. But what makes people happy is feeling connected to others, having warm relationships, and being part of something bigger than themselves. And so that's just in terms of what you were just saying, like what it feels like. I think a lot of people are feeling hopeless and scared, either consciously or unconsciously, because of climate stuff, because of the intense political conditions we're living in, because of the brutalities we're seeing in the headlines every day, famine and war and, babies in prisons at the border and all of these things. And I think feeling like you're part of anything or helping anyone is reconnecting. And I think that for me, we live in a society that's made this huge divide between work and pleasure. And so work is like this place you go and it's like you're supposed to kind of suffer through it and you complain about it and be kind of numb and bored. And then pleasure is like total escapism. There's no room in there for connected collaboration towards something you believe in. And so like what it feels like I'll also say too, that we live in a society in which like social movements have been erased and in which we're told like, if you want to help, like, on Thanksgiving, go to a soup kitchen. There's like these charity models that are like really, really empty, instead of like, what would it be like to be like part of a long-term project in my neighborhood to provide childcare to people who don't have it, or to be part of a long-term project visiting people in prison and making sure that they get to stay connected to their families and giving people rides? Or what would it be? What's it like to not see that as work, to get it out of that framework of like the thing I have to avoid so that I can go play video games or watch movies or go on tropical vacation? Like that, for me, trying to reclaim my own, because I would even sometimes find myself treating activist work in that same work way, even though I'm doing it, like I'm not getting paid for it. I want to do it, but I still get in that mentality that I think is actually internalized capitalism. And so how to be like, okay, my actual happiness comes from doing things that are meaningful to me. There might be something like, it's like not fun to wait in a prison waiting room, or it's not always fun to be in a car in traffic with people, but like there's a deeper connected, or like be part of a blockade of a road or get arrested, or, there's lots of things, or work on a spreadsheet so you can figure out who's taking care of this thing, but there's a reframing of our experience that I think is really required to get out of that work escapism framework and to be with each other in a different way and be with ourselves in a different way. And I think part of the word self, being in self-help or being in self-care, is about having a new relationship to ourselves. So it does matter. Like that self piece does matter, but a lot of getting to develop that relationship with each other is like even learning how to be with myself while I'm with you, learning how to remember myself and remember what I believe in and care about when I'm in a group, even if the group disagrees with me, or even if I'm scared or uncomfortable right now, like learning how to hold, like that's, I think this thing I was talking about before, like learning to notice your autopilot reactions is about, and maybe also not have to follow them and act them all out, is about this like restored relationship to self that I think is, for a lot of people, that can kind of happen therapeutically through doing things you believe in groups. Or you can join groups and just like play out all your shit and just like, react in those ways and need to be on top or need to disappear or need to bail or, or need to get everyone to date you or whatever it is. And then kind of have a lot of drama.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dean, there's so many more parts of this book that I feel like we could talk about, but I guess I'll just have to have you on again when the book comes out and talk more. But can you say a little bit more about who this book is for, who your audience is, who you have in mind?
I really want it to be for people who are already activists and struggling with conflict in their groups or struggling with, their dating life is a mess. They keep making the same mistake over and over again. They can't figure out why they always end up in the same situation, or they're in the same kinds of fights with their friends over and over again, or they feel like isolated in the context of it or burnt out from activism. All of those people, but also for people who haven't been involved in activism yet, but are interested in changing things and also might feel like, I don't know how to start. I'm scared to go to spaces with other people in them. I know I should be doing something different, but I can't stop just playing this video game or just watching these TV shows. I think I'm hoping it's useful to a wide range of people who in some way or another care about the world, like are mad about sexism or racism or whatever, but also noticing patterns inside their personal life or inside the groups they're in that are holding them back in some way from what they care about.
Mm-hmm. Great. So Dean, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
So right now I'm living in upstate New York, working on this book for this month, and there are so many fireflies here. And I grew up in Virginia where there was a lot of fireflies, but I've been living on the West Coast where there isn't. So I just want to name that fireflies really, it's just like, in case you thought like there's no magic, it's just like it's so exquisitely beautiful and ridiculous and glittery and glamorous. And it makes me reconnect to a kind of queer beauty that isn't just the city kind, but it's just the kind that's just already here on offer.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say as a California boy, someone who grew up without fireflies, the first time that I saw them, I was like, wow, they are very magical. And then the first time I saw a glowworm was even more blown away too.
Or the bioluminescence in the ocean.
So Dean, where can people find you and learn more about your work and hear about your book when it's ready?
Yeah, almost all of my things are at deanspade.net. And I also have a website called bigdoorbrigade.com that I want to recommend. That's all about doing mutual aid projects. It's got a toolkit about existing mutual aid projects and how to build projects where you're actually directly plugging into helping people and making the change you want. And it's just trying to give people a way in. I think a lot of people are really angry and scared right now and have been since Trump became president. And I'm just trying to help people find out that they have the power to do stuff. It's not just about responding to things on social media or voting once every 2 to 4 years. There's a lot more we can all be engaged in to support each other. So bigdoorbrigade.com is another kind of attempt of an inroad for that.
All right. Well, I will have those in the show notes so people can also find them there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here.
It was great talking to you.
I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.